Imagine waking up tomorrow to an urgent breaking news alert that halts everything. Overnight, planes from the United States and Israel flew over the Middle East and launched strikes on strategic facilities in Iran. Within hours, Tehran promises retaliation. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. Oil prices skyrocket. Stock markets around the world crash. Warships begin to maneuver. China speaks out. Russia responds. Analysts repeat a phrase no one wanted to hear again. The world has entered the most dangerous moment in decades. But could this really happen? And if it did, what would come next? To understand this hypothetical scenario, we need to go back in time. The tension between the United States and Iran didn't start yesterday. In 1953, a U.S.-backed coup overthrew Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he tried to nationalize the country's oil. The Shah was strengthened and ruled with Western support. Decades later, in 1979, the Islamic Revolution changed everything. The new regime came to see the United States as a strategic enemy. Since then, economic sanctions, military threats, and indirect confrontations have shaped this relationship. Israel, meanwhile, sees Iran's nuclear program as an existential threat. And this is exactly where the risk of a preemptive strike enters the debate. Now imagine that strike actually happens. Cruise missiles launched from ships in the Persian Gulf. F-35 fighter jets crossing Iranian airspace under cover of darkness. Nuclear facilities in Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan hit in sequence. The operation would be precise, fast, and devastating. But no military plan can control what comes next. Iran's response would not take long. Ballistic missiles aimed at U.S. bases in the Gulf. Hezbollah opening a second front in northern Israel with its arsenal of over 100,000 rockets. Iranian militias in Iraq attacking U.S. positions in Baghdad. Houthis in Yemen intensifying attacks on ships in the Red Sea. In a matter of hours, a conflict that began surgically and locally would spread in multiple directions simultaneously, and the entire Middle East would be on fire. Then comes the blow that would shake the entire world, not just the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz, a maritime corridor less than 50 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, squeezed between Iran and Oman, through which about 20% of all globally traded oil passes. 20%. Europe, Asia, parts of the Americas. If Iran decided to close it or threaten it with underwater mines, anti-ship missiles, or attacks on oil tankers, the effects would be felt at every gas pump, on every supermarket shelf, in every electricity bill worldwide. Oil prices could double in days. Analysts warn of scenarios where a barrel could surpass $200, something the world has never seen. Every extra dollar in oil translates to more expensive fuel, more expensive transportation, and more expensive food. Inflation, which has haunted economies worldwide in recent years, would return with unprecedented force. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now, because in the next few minutes, we'll show how every country, including Brazil, would be swept up in this crisis. And write the word Hormuz in the comments. Everyone needs to know this name to understand what drives global geopolitics. China would be the most unpredictable piece on this chessboard. The world's largest oil importer, with a deep strategic partnership with Iran, cemented in a 25-year cooperation deal, Beijing would not remain idle. On the diplomatic front, it would call emergency sessions at the UN, demanding a ceasefire. But while diplomats speak in New York, Chinese generals would be moving warships in the Indian Ocean. And China could wield its greatest weapon without firing a single shot, threatening to cut purchases of U.S. Treasury bonds, accelerating yuan transactions, and weakening the dollar as a global reserve currency. The rivalry between Washington and Beijing, already intense in technology and trade, would enter an entirely new phase. Russia, in turn, would have powerful strategic reasons to exploit the crisis. Moscow wouldn't need to fight directly. Supplying Iran with advanced air defense systems, sharing intelligence, positioning forces in the Mediterranean, and using the conflict as a smokescreen for its own objectives in Europe would be enough. The world would face a multi-front crisis, testing U.S. response capacity like never before. Now let's talk about what this scenario would do to your money and global financial markets. This is where the conflict moves from headlines to the doorsteps of every investor and every family. The first move would be a massive flight to safe haven assets. Gold would soar. In past severe geopolitical crises, the precious metal jumped 20, 30, even 40% in weeks. In this scenario, it could reach historic highs. Those holding gold, whether physical, ETFs, or mining stocks, could see their wealth grow while the world burns. The US dollar would behave unpredictably, short-term appreciation as investors seek safety, but long-term uncertainty, especially if China and Russia accelerate de-dollarization during the crisis. Stock markets would be crushed. Wall Street would open in freefall. Technology, consumer, and travel sectors would take the hardest hits. Meanwhile, oil, gas, and defense stocks would soar. Savvy investors who understand this cycle could find real opportunities, while most would panic without direction. Emerging markets would be hit hard. Countries dependent on oil imports would face double pressure, rising commodity prices, and capital flight to safer assets in developed nations. Currencies would devalue, inflation would accelerate, and central banks would be forced to hike rates while their economies are already stressed. And Brazil, the country occupies a unique position in this scenario. Even as a major oil producer, its refining capacity has historical bottlenecks. A brutal surge in oil prices would hit fuel, freight, and food costs for the population. Chronic Brazilian inflation, sensitive to external shocks, could spike aggressively, forcing the central bank to hold or raise interest rates, stalling economic growth. On the other hand, Petrobras and the energy sector would see revenues rise with higher oil prices. The real would fluctuate unpredictably. For Brazilian investors, the lesson is clear. Diversification and understanding the global landscape is not a luxury, it's financial survival. Yet there is something all economic models struggle to calculate, something numbers cannot capture: the risk of miscalculation. History is full of wars nobody wanted, but which happened because one side underestimated the other. In 1914, no European leader believed the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo would trigger World War I. In 1950, Americans did not expect China to send hundreds of thousands of troops to Korea. Escalation logic has a life of its own, and once it starts spinning, stopping is far harder than any war room plan suggests. In a conflict between the US, Israel, and Iran, the risk of miscalculation would be immense. What if Iran, cornered and desperate, used a weapon nobody expected? What if a missile missed its target and hit a territory of a power that was only observing? In high-intensity conflicts, accidents happen, and accidents between nuclear powers have a very different name: irreversible catastrophe. This is where geopolitics stops being abstract and becomes deeply personal. At the center of all these scenarios, numbers, troop movements, oil barrels, and market swings, are people. Families who slept before the explosions. Workers who can no longer afford fuel. Mothers at supermarkets wondering why everything suddenly costs more. Geopolitics is not a chess game played in air-conditioned rooms by men in suits. It's the invisible force shaping the daily lives of billions who have never heard of the Strait of Hormuz and don't understand why gas prices spike when something blows up 10,000 kilometers away. Understanding these connections isn't just the task of diplomats and analysts, it's the responsibility of every citizen who wants to make informed decisions about their life, investments, and future. The question that remains, the one that should disturb us, is both simple and terrifying. Is the world prepared to manage a crisis of this magnitude without losing control? Does diplomacy still have enough strength to contain military logic once it starts moving? Or have we reached a point where, once set in motion, the gears turn on their own until the end? I can't give a definitive answer. No one can. But here's one thing I can say with certainty. Ignoring these issues is a luxury the modern world can no longer afford. If this video made you see the world differently, hit like now. Share it with someone who needs to understand these connections. And in the comments, tell me, do you think a conflict like this is inevitable? Or is there still room for diplomacy to hold the world together? See you in the next video.